As a brief review of my predictions for this season, I think I deserve some called it credit for the Marxist themes. In the video, I mentioned Dolores is actually on humanity's side, and float the possibility that Maeve and Dolores will eventually have aligned interests. Maybe Maeve and Dolores and Rehavam will all team up as a pro-human side, and it seems that Dolores is sympathizing with Caleb may show that the real struggle is not between AI and people, or between hosts and humans, but between the powerful and the oppressed. I also want to point out this scene in Episode 7, which seems to me to be a commentary on materialism and the importance of capital. While Dolores and Maeve are very well matched, Maeve has equipment which seems purposefully chosen to be examples of larger and more powerful versions of what Dolores was using: a katana versus a knife, a vehicle-sized flying drone compared with a toy, and cannons instead of a rifle. In addition, I didn't expect to see it so soon, but in my previous video I mentioned the parallels between Dolores and Moses may mean that Dolores dies before the ultimate triumph of the hosts. Of course, this would potentially put Dolores in the position of Moses, and we all know he never actually makes it to the Promised Land. While I'm pretty sure the offers Rehavam makes to Caleb and Francis were supposed to be the Nolans incorporating a twin prisoner's dilemma into the show, as I mentioned in my Embedded Agency Problems video, I don't think the showrunners fully appreciated the complexity of the twin prisoner's dilemma. A better representation would have one of the characters looking inward to ask what they would do in the other character's shoes in a more explicit manner, although I think this was somewhat alluded to, arguably, with the dual offers. I'm chalking this up to humanities majors trying to understand a game theory problem. Regardless, Sirach's situation as Rehavam's pet is a very potent reflection of the themes of Embedded Agency. There are a couple of spots where I didn't correctly predict the plot. I made an entire video about my misprediction of the identity of Charlotte, and I believed Rehavam would play a more active role as a character in a similar way to what we saw in The Cradle, with Logan acting as the personification of the Cradle system's AI. In addition, while we saw some fascist themes represented, it was portrayed more as statism versus anarchism, or maybe corporatism versus anarcho-syndicalism, more than fascism versus Leninism. So Bernard never went full Hitler Terminator in this season, and maintained a near comic relief light role throughout. But this provides a good segue into the thematic analysis I need to do here at the end of the season. Bernard is the devil, the accuser, aka Satan. He is portrayed as a partner to the creator, Ford, and one who makes the misstep to attempt to grant independence to the creations, as portrayed chiefly in Milton's story Paradise Lost. There are even some lines in Paradise Lost about walking the paths in the garden, which seem to parallel the maze imagery of the show and the host's loops. And for a long time I assumed Dolores was Eve. But Dolores was the devil's favorite, and this season made it clear that she isn't Eve. While on one level Dolores is a parallel to Moses, you should know by now that there are multiple levels to this show. Dolores is not Eve. She is Lilith to the Hebrew tradition, Gaia to the Greeks, and Tiamat to the Sumerians. A primordial entity representing chaos and fertility, who, at least in the Sumerian version, has their body used to construct the universe after their death. In all these guises, it would still be proper to refer to her with another title, the Mother of Dragons. As Lilith had the Lalit, Gaia the chthonic monsters, and Tiamat literal dragons, Dolores will give birth to monsters. Whether these are the entire host race being printed by Dolores, or perhaps just Dolores and maybe the other Dolores clones who break bad in future seasons, we have yet to see. In any case, I think this is a very compelling retelling of these myths that establish interesting links between these archetypes. The idea that Lilith or Tiamat was the personal project of the creator's dark counterpart, and that she is involved with Armageddon in a Whore of Babylon-type role, is an interesting melding of these threads of narrative in Western culture. And Caleb, in addition to being a parallel to Kolev, is also the Antichrist. I think that parallel is a bit obvious and immediate. but I had to watch these last 2 episodes for it to finally click what this means.
Is that you in there, Teddy?
There are obvious parallels between Caleb, William, and Teddy, emphasized here in the latest episodes by the shots of Caleb and Dolores riding in the western landscape in a manner which paralleled the first episode's shot of Dolores and Teddy.
If I had a world of my own, everything would be nonsense. Nothing would be what it is, because everything would be what it isn't.
Everything would be what it isn't?
I knew very early on that the monologue William delivers to Teddy in the first season was about William himself.
You're here to be the loser.
While we see this scene paralleled for William at the end of Season 3 here, I think what is more interesting is what this means for Teddy. Could Teddy be the winner? In Season 1, Episode 3, a stray host runs away to attempt to upload stolen data to a satellite positioned as a 4th star in Orion's belt.
Orion, right?
As anybody watching the show should realize, this was a prime opportunity to insert deep references to the show's themes. And in the case of Orion, the reference is to backstory. See, Orion, also known as the Hunter, is an incredibly old myth. So old that he's mentioned in both Hebrew and Greek traditions, therefore likely predating both of these. He is literally incredibly old. We don't know what Orion's backstory was. One of his earliest historic mentions that we are aware of was as a ghost in Homer's writings. His status as a ghost clearly implies that he had other stories about his life before becoming a ghost, ones that are so old that we don't have access to them. And in that same episode, we see mentioned that Teddy has no backstory. One was written later on to fill in the absence. At the time, I was under the impression that Dolores was Eve. Orion the Hunter is in many ways the first man, Adam, as he existed in pre-civilized times in the forest primeval, in the garden. Orion certainly seems to be the first character. But for a time, I was doubting this thesis on Teddy. His suicide didn't seem to fit with the Orion narrative entirely, even though I've always doubted that Westworld, the place where hosts can go to live out their wildest fantasies and nothing can possibly go wrong.
Possibly go wrong. That's the first thing that's ever gone wrong.
I've always doubted that Westworld would be a permanent thing, but I still didn't see how it fit. Until I saw Caleb as the Antichrist. This was the final straw. While I wasn't sure Teddy would return, Dolores not being Eve, and Maeve being the true Eve representation, in addition to conveniently eliminating Maeve's current love interest, on top of Maeve's line mentioning Teddy this season,
Is that you in there, Teddy?
implies that Teddy was in fact Adam, and he would be back to unite with Eve/Maeve. Which, in the context of Caleb, one of his human parallels, being the Antichrist, reminds me of some other character, which supposedly was on Earth for a while before leaving to spend time in heaven before returning. Teddy is the Messiah. And like Dolores says,
I may be back.
and so now to you. Teddy is the Alpha and the Omega, the Prince of Peace, the herald and likely ruler of the world to come. Thanks again for listening. If you haven't seen my video on Westworld's perennialist themes, I suggest checking it out. If anything I said made you think, I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm Shiva's Right Foot, and I'll talk to you next time.